of the 80s with me, your pal Jamie Fenderson. Today we're going to talk about 1985. And to do that, let's start with We are the world, we are the children, we are the ones who make a brighter day, so let's start giving. We Are the World. It's a charity single by the supergroup called USA for Africa, released on March 7, 1985. I talked briefly in our last podcast episode of Band-Aid and Do They Know It's Christmas in 1984. This was a British thing, though. I didn't know that. It was like a totally British thing. So Harry Belafonte wanted to do a US version. So this was all about fundraising for a really bad famine in Africa. The song was written by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie and produced by Quincy Jones. It sold 20 million physical copies. It was the 8th best-selling single of all time. In addition to Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, other contributors included Stevie Wonder, Cyndi Lauper, Bruce Springsteen, Ray Charles, Huey Lewis, Dionne Warwick, Diana Ross, Steve Perry, Hall & Oates, Tina Turner, Sheila E., Bob Dylan, Bette Midler, Smokey Robinson, Kenny Loggins, Billy Joel, Paul Simon, and Dan Aykroyd. For some reason, Dan Aykroyd was in that choir. So these are some of the biggest pop music stars of all time. And Dan Aykroyd. Notably absent, though, was John Denver, who was deliberately rejected. So Ken Cragen, the music manager and producer, turned down John Denver because, quote, some people, unquote, felt that John's image would affect the credibility of the song as a pop rock anthem. John was pretty sad about it, especially since he was a philanthropist. He did a lot of charity work. And, you know, there were country singers. Willie Nelson was in it, and Kenny Rogers was on the roster. By the way, Kenny Rogers' manager was Ken Cragen. Just saying. Hashtag justice for John Denver. So the success of the charity singles spawned a multi-venue benefit concert held on July 13th, 1985. There was one concert in London's Wembley Stadium and the other in John F. Kennedy Stadium in Philadelphia. There were other inspired concerts at the same time, including concerts in the USSR, Canada, Japan, Australia, and West Germany, among others. And then one of the organizers, Bob Geldof, quoted saying, we took an issue that was nowhere on the political agenda and, through the lingua franca of the planet, which is not English, but rock and roll, we were able to address the intellectual absurdity and the moral repulsion of people dying of want in a world of surplus. That's very Bill and Ted Saves the World, isn't it? So some of the U.S. acts at this concert were the Hooters, Billy Ocean, Black Sabbath, Run DMC, Rick Springfield, REO Speedwagon, Judas Priest, Bryan Adams, Santana, Tom Petty, Kenny Loggins, The Cars, and Eric Clapton. Duran Duran, Hall & Oates, Mick Jagger did a duet with Tina Turner. Can you believe that? And Phil Collins. And Madonna, she was there too. She was huge in 1985. We have a whole podcast about Madonna in 1985. You should check it out. The US concert ended with We Are the World. Some of the UK concert participants were Phil Collins. I said he was in the US one. He performed first in London, then he took a helicopter to the US and performed there because Phil Collins is a badass. Also, there was Ultravox, Elvis Costello, Sting, U2, Dire Straits, David Bowie, The Who, Elton John, and Paul McCartney. And then Queen. So Queen's probably the most famous Live Aid performance. Their music is just catchy and interactive, so that's why it's often used in sporting events. And Freddie Mercury is so charismatic, so he involved the whole crowd. And he kind of owned the crowd. They were vibing together. So there's a famous photo of him and the huge crowd. They were just vibing out together. And the UK concert ended with Do They Know It's Christmas So let's talk a little bit more about music from some people I didn't mention in that huge concert. Wham! Wham was huge in 85. They had 4 singles on the Billboard year-end, including the number 1 single of 1985, Careless Whisper. You probably know this from the saxophone riff. Rainy, rainy. It's kind of a meme now. Like sax music is used for cheesy love or campy sexiness, but back then it was legit. The saxophone solo was actually played by Steve Gregory, who was a freelance saxophonist that you'd call if you needed like someone to play sexy saxophone. And they also had the number 3 hit, Wake Me Up Before You Go. That's a cool song. It's so catchy. And they had these Choose Life t-shirts. There's a misconception that it was like pro-life or anti-abortion, but it was actually to promote like anti-drug and anti-suicide. Whitney Houston released her self-titled debut album on February 14th. And then although a slow starter, it became the first debut album and the first album by a solo female artist to produce 3 number 1 singles in the US. It would go on to receive 4 Grammy nominations. And in 2013, the album was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Not bad for a debut solo album, huh? Tears for Fears had 3 number 1 hits, including Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Tears for Fears was awesome. And then I want to talk about Aha, Take On Me, which was number 10 year-end single. And I think a lot of people agree it was one of the best music videos of all time. It mixed like real people with sketch animation, comic book stuff. It was pretty awesome. It was nominated for 8 and won 6 MTV Music Video Awards the following year. Let's talk about movies. So going through this journey back in time, I'm reminded how great the movies were in the 1980s. It really was a golden age for cinema. It's sad to see movie theaters like where I live. There's one nearby, and it's just kind of like dead. In 1985, it'd be packed with families and groups of teens. And I don't know. I think in addition to streaming, movies aren't that great. At least they're, in my opinion, they're not as good as they were in the 80s, which is why they kind of remake movies from the 80s. The number 1 film of the year was Back to the Future. This is one of those perfect 80s movies. I could just watch again and again now, even though I've seen it hundreds of times, and I could just love it just as much. We have a podcast episode all about Back to the Future. There's a search bar in the 80s and 90s.com. Type in Back to the Future and check it out. The next 2 biggest films of the year both starred Sylvester Stallone as iconic tough guys fighting Russians. Number 2 was Rambo First Blood Part 2, and number 3 was Rocky IV. The funny thing is that even though these were among the biggest films of the year, they were nominated and won multiple Golden Raspberries. So Rambo First Blood Part 2 won for Worst Picture, won for Worst Screenplay, Worst Original Song called Peace in Our Life by his brother Frank Stallone, and it was nominated for Worst Supporting Actress, Julia Nixon's soul as Kobal. That was Rambo's girlfriend. And then Rocky IV was nominated for Worst Picture, lost the honor to Rambo. Nominated for Worst Supporting Actor, Burt Young as Paulie. Nominated for Worst Supporting Actress, Talia Shire as Adrian. And it won for Worst Musical Score, composed by Vince DiCola. So Sylvester Stallone and Brigitte Nielsen, they were actually married on December 15th, 1985. And they'd both get beat up in the Razzies. So Stallone won Worst Actor twice. One for Rambo and one for Rocky. And won for Worst Director for Rocky IV. And then Brigitte Nielsen also had a double whammy, winning twice for Worst New Star. One for playing Drago's wife in Rocky IV, and one for her role in Red Sonja, which also came out that year. She would also beat out co-star Talia Shire and Rambo's Julia Nelson's soul to win Worst Supporting Actress for Rocky IV. By the way, Stallone and Brigitte Nielsen, their marriage would not last. So about a year and a half later, they divorced. That's a lot of Razzies for the second and third top grossing films of the year. So now we have to talk about The Goonies. I love this movie. Released on June 7th, 1985, directed by Richard Donner, and the screenplay was by Chris Columbus, and the story was by Steven Spielberg. This film was so much fun. It's about a group of kids in Astoria, Oregon, who go on an epic pirate adventure to find treasure to save their house. It's every kid's dream. It's so cool. I've been to Astoria a number of times. It's not far from where I live. And the jail where the Fratellis break out, that's actually the Oregon Film Museum now. You can go in and interact, and you can go there and hang out. And then the Goonies house used to be owned by someone who was pretty angry with fans because they'd always show up to their house and take pictures. But now a new person bought it. It's actually a couple who are embracing the Goonies, and they have plans, if they haven't already, to open it up. So good job. The couple is from Kansas City, the Zaccharies, and they bought it as an investment. And if they're going to do cool stuff with it, I agree with their investment. And then Cannon Beach is really nice. That's where a number of scenes were filmed, including the big beach race at the beginning where the Fratellis shake off the cops. And I've vacationed there a number of times. Yeah, Astoria or North Oregon coast is on my list of possible move to places when my son goes off to college, which is not far away. So I can only list a few movies that call out to me because there's so many good movies in 1985. And I have that Domino's 30 minutes or less guarantee. So The Breakfast Club was great. We have a John Hughes tribute podcast episode you should listen to. Mask, starring Cher, Sam Elliott, and Eric Stoltz. This is a sweet movie. It's a good movie, and you should watch that if you haven't seen it. The Last Dragon is kung fu 80s weirdness. My son asked me when I made him watch it, he's like, Dad, did people in the 80s know how 80s this is? Like, this is so 80s that even people in the 80s must have known that it was 80s. Lady Hawk, directed by Richard Donner, stars Rutger Hauer and Michelle Pfeiffer and Matthew Broderick. That's a cool fantasy movie. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, so cool. Tina Turner starred as the villain and had a hit song, We Don't Need Another Hero. Another movie I loved, Explorers. So this is another kind of those 80s style group of kids build a spaceship and they go visit aliens. So cool. Weird Science. So every kid wanted to build their own Kelly LeBrock from a computer. Pee-wee's Big Adventure. So this was Tim Burton's first big film. And we have a whole podcast just about Tim Burton. And we also have another podcast about Pee Wee Herman versus Ernest P. Worrell. Those are things you should go to the 80s and 90s.com right now and check out. Teen Wolf, starring Michael J. Fox. He turns into a werewolf and he's a teenager and everybody just kind of accepts it because he's good at basketball. Commando, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. We have a podcast all about like best movie one-liners, and this movie is prolific throughout that. And then Legend by Ridley Scott. It's a cool fantasy movie. I really like Tim Curry's Devil. And then Enemy Mine, I think, is an underrated classic, starring Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr. about some battling, humans versus aliens, but they get stuck on a planet and they got to befriend each other. Underrated, awesome movie. So here are some of the films we've reviewed on the 80s and 90s Overlooked YouTube channel. Reanimator by Stuart Gordon, starring Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton. Stuart Gordon is officially a patron saint of the 80s and 90s.com and associated properties. We love him. Better Off Dead by Savage Steve Holland, starring John Cusack. This was a request from one of our friends. And then, if you haven't seen this, you have to. Gymkata. It's so stupid. It's this gymnastic martial arts It's ridiculous, but so fun. Go watch our review on that if you watch nothing else. In the world of technology, Microsoft Windows 1.0 was released in 1985. It required a minimum of a whole 256 kilobytes of memory and cost $100. Some criticized it as a dud because the operating system had a over-reliance on this silly thing called a mouse. That's 1985, man. And then on March 15th, 1985, the first domain ever was registered. It was called symbolics.com. Now it's kind of an online museum of sorts. We didn't know about the internet in 1985, but it was around in its primordial form. So, food and beverage history. The Coca-Cola Company introduced Cherry Coke in early 1985. And this was a good move since it was popular and it's still around today. And they did this because people were making their own by mixing cherry syrup to fountain Coke. So they just thought, we might as well do that for you. But then they did something silly and controversial by introducing New Coke on April 23rd, 1985. It was sweeter, kind of a reformulated recipe. The 80s had a big fit, though. So they had to keep the original, and they called it Coca-Cola Classic. And the new stuff was just called Coke. Later, I think it was called Coke 2. But they discontinued it finally in 2002. And then Cinnabon was founded. This would become a fixture in malls in the 1980s. It opened on December 4th. In my area of the world, at the SeaTac Mall in Federal Way, Washington State. And now they're all over the world. So there's two books I want to talk about. The first is the science fiction classic Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. If you don't know about this book and you've never seen the movie, don't look anything up about it. If you don't know anything about it, don't look anything up, I'm telling you. Just go read it. You'll thank me. You're welcome. Second is If You Give a Mouse a Cookie by Laura Joffe Numeroff. It's illustrated by Felicia Bond, and it's a children's book. And I didn't read it when I was a kid, but I read it to my son when he was a little kid. And it's just a lot of fun because it's about this, this insatiable little mouse. He just keeps wanting more shit, so it makes kids crack up. It's really pretty funny if you read it to a kid, and little kids just crack up because this little mouse just keeps wanting stuff. If you give a mouse a cookie, man, he just wants all kinds of other things. It's a cute book. It's great for little kids. So let's talk a little bit about sports. On March 6th, Mike Tyson KO'd Hector Mercedes at the 1 minute 47 second in the first round in his first professional fight. So Mike Tyson would go on to become the undisputed world heavyweight boxing champion. And we have a podcast episode all about Mike Tyson because he was big in the 80s. After his first fight, he was huge. Go to the 80sand90s.com/podcast and click on a link called Sports, and you'll see Mike Tyson, our podcast about him, and others as well. And then on January 13th, Wayne Gretzky scored his 400th career NHL goal in his 436th career game. Wayne Gretzky was like the most famous hockey player of the 80s, and maybe he's still the most famous hockey player of all time. Now we're going to get into television. VH1 debuted on January 1st, 1985, and it was kind of building on the success of MTV, but it played music videos that were kind of for a slightly older demographic, kind of focused on the lighter, softer pop for adults who could drink wine. I like their factoid pop-ups. I don't know when that came out, but I like that. And they also have some good Behind the Music series. On January 4th, Sesame Street broadcast its 2000th episode. Sesame Street was huge, man. Huge. That's just the Gen X thing, the Sesame Street. Everybody watched it. And then Nick at Night launched on July 1st on Nickelodeon. It was kind of designed to give grown-ups something to watch on Nickelodeon in the evening and at night. But I watched a lot of it. In fact, I'm kind of a classic TV rerun expert because I watched a lot of Nick at Night. So people wonder why I'm so good at knowing about shows from like the 50s and 60s. As you can thank Nick at Night for that. And then shows that debuted: Moonlighting with Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd, Mr. Belvedere, Small Wonder. It was a weird show about like an android girl. We have a podcast about reboots, and this is one I think they should reboot in kind of a dark way. The Golden Girls. So good. I love the Golden Girls. I don't care what anybody says. And we have a whole podcast where we compare them, like the 4 girls with the 4 Ninja Turtles, because everybody wants to know what's going on with that, right? Growing Pains. We have a podcast about theme songs, and that's definitely on there. Spencer for Hire. MacGyver. Oh, I love MacGyver. So cool. We have a podcast. Guess what? We have a podcast. It's MacGyver versus Magnum P.I. You should check that out. That's a good one. It's one of our earlier episodes. And then some cartoons that debuted. Thundercats. Thundercats was cool. Oh, guess what? We have a podcast. But this podcast is fun. One of our most popular ones. It's about Mumra from Thundercats versus Skeletor from He-Man. And we actually come to the conclusion that they're both kind of the good guys. So you should check this podcast out. Robotech premiered in the US. There were Star Wars shows. I forgot about these. Star Wars Droids and Ewoks. Gummy Bears. The Wuzzles. Mask. That was pretty cool. It's about these bad guys and good guys, and they wear these masks that have powers, and they have like transforming vehicles. Very into like selling toys. That's the 80s for you. The Care Bears. The Care Bears were huge in the 80s. They debuted in 1985. And then Jem, who's truly outrageous. Truly outrageous. I kind of had a crush on Cartoon Jem. I won't lie. I can have a crush on cartoons when you're a kid. I don't care. So there you have it. 1985 in a nutshell. What do you think about 1985? Drop me a line or leave a comment wherever you're listening to this podcast. And with that, I'm going to say I'm out of here like Chunk's dignity as Mouth forced him to do the truffle shuffle just to get through the gate to the Goonies house in beautiful Astoria, Oregon. See you in 1986.